New York, 1900. A city of dreams. Millions arrived here, chasing a better life. But for many, reality was far darker than the dream. Poverty, discrimination, survival. And in the shadows of this chaos, something powerful was quietly being born. Not a government, not a business, an empire. This wasn't just crime. This was organized power. A system where loyalty meant everything. And betrayal, men, death. This was the beginning of what the world would later call the American Mafia. The immigrants who built an EMP, or most of them came from one place. Italy, especially from the poor, lawless regions of Sicily. Back there, the government was weak. People didn't trust the police. So they created their own system, a secret society, a code, a way of survival. Take Hadit, Cosa Nostra. When these immigrants arrived in America, they didn't leave that system behind. They brought it with them. Hidden, silent, waiting. At first, it was small. Street gangs, petty crime, protection rackets. But Evan 10, something was different. This wasn't random violence. It was structured, organized, disciplined. Enter the early GNGs in the streets of New York. Different gangs started forming. Each one fighting for control. Each one trying to survive. Among them, one name began to rise. A young, ambitious criminal. Charles Luciano. He wasn't like the others. Most gangsters thought small. Luciano thought like a businessman. He understood something powerful. Greater than crime didn't have to be chaotic. Greater than crime could be organized. But before Luciano could build an empire, New York had to go through hell. The chaos before the ORDR of the early 1900s weren't controlled. They were violent. Gangs fought in the streets. Shootings were common. No rules, no structure, just blood. Then came something that changed everything. A law. A single decision that would turn crime into a gold mine. Prohibition. The game Siacha-Yarin, 1920. The US government made alcohol illegal. This moment is known as Prohibition in the United States. And overnight, everything changed. People didn't stop drinking. They just started buying. Illegally. And that created something massive. A black market worth millions of dollars. The gangs saw it immediately. This wasn't just crime anymore. This was business. Bootlegging. Smuggling. Illegal bars. Money started flowing like never before. And with money came power. The rise of violency. But there was one problem. Too many gangs. Too much money. Everyone wanted control. And that led to one thing. War. The streets of New York turned into a battlefield. Italian gangs fought each other. Irish gangs fought back. Violence spread everywhere. But inside this chaos, Luciano was watching, learning, planning. He saw something others didn't. Greater than if the gangs kept fighting. Everyone would lose. So he decided to change the game. Forever, the vision of Luciano had a different idea. Instead of constant war, why not create order? Why not turn crime into an empire? But to do that, he had to break old traditions. At that time, the mafia was controlled by old-school bosses. They followed strict Sicilian rules. No outsiders, no change. Only tradition. Luciano didn't agree. He believed in power, not tradition. And that belief would lead to one of the most important turning points in mafia history. The Castellamarese WR between 1929 and 1931, New York exploded into violence. This war is known as Castellamarese, or two powerful bosses went to war. Joe Masu. This was a full-scale war. Assassinations, ambushes, Betrayals. Bodies dropped across the city. Luciano was in the middle of it, working for Mafia, but thinking far beyond him, because Luciano knew something greater than this war was pointless. So, he made a decision, a dangerous one, the betrayal that changed EVR. Chilean, 1931. Luciano betrayed his own boss. Joe Mafia was murdered while eating in a restaurant. It wasn't random. It was planned, calculated, cold. With Mafia gone, the war shifted. Soon after, the other boss, Salvatore Maranzano, declared himself the boss of bosses. But Luciano had no intention of serving under anyone. So just months later, Maranzano was also assassinated. 2 bosses gone in the same year. And just like that, the old mafia system collapsed. The birth of a new empire after the bloodshed. Luciano did something no one expected. He didn't take full control. He didn't call himself king. Instead, he created a system, a structure, an organization. This became known as the Commission, a council of powerful crime bosses, each controlling their own territory, but working together. No more unnecessary wars. No more Charles and only business. And just like that, the American Mafia was reborn. Stronger than ever. The 5 families under this new system. New York was divided into 5 powerful groups, together known as 5 families. Each family had its own boss, its own soldiers, its own empire, but all of them followed the same rules. To Sama code, a code of silence, a code of loyalty, a code that would make them untouchable for decades. Omert, the code of excellency, Ethis code had an M. Omert, it meant one thing: never talk. Not to the police, not to outsiders, not even under threat of death. Breaking this code was the ultimate betrayal, and the punishment always the same: death. Hash, hash, hash. The empire BGIing us. By the early 1930s, the transformation was complete. What started as small street gangs had become a powerful criminal empire. They controlled gambling, alcohol, labor unions, and most importantly, they were organized. But this was just the beginning, because what Luciano built wasn't just powerful, it was unstoppable. In the next part, we go deeper into the golden age of the Mafia, where money, power, and fear ruled New York, and the 5 families became the most powerful criminal network in American history. New York, the 1930s. The war was over, the blood had dried, and out of that chaos, a new order had taken control. Not the politicians, not the police, but something far more powerful: the Mafia. At the center of it all was one man, Charles Luciano. He didn't just win a war, he redesigned crime itself. For the first time in history, organized crime in America wasn't random anymore. It was structured, calculated, efficient, and most importantly, it was profitable. Luciano's greatest creation wasn't violence, it was organization. He established the Commission, and through it, every major decision now had a process. No unnecessary killings, no reckless wars. Everything had to be approved. Think of it like a board of directors, but instead of businessmen, these were the most dangerous criminals in America. Each family had its territory, its rackets, its soldiers, and together, they formed a system that would dominate New York for decades to come. The city was divided among the legendary 5 families, each one powerful, each one feared. They didn't just control crime, they controlled the city itself. Construction, shipping, garbage collection, labor unions, even politicians. If money was moving in New York, the Mafia had a hand in it, and if someone refused to cooperate, they disappeared. With Prohibition still creating massive illegal profits, the Mafia learned something important. Crime wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about wealth. Millions of dollars flowed through their networks. Hidden businesses, secret deals, off the books, operations. They built an underground economy that rivaled the legal one. And unlike normal businesses, there were no taxes, no regulations, no limits. Luciano wasn't alone. He surrounded himself with men who were just as dangerous and just as intelligent. One of them was Frank Costello. Costello wasn't known for violence. He was known for influence. He built connections with politicians, judges, and police officials. While others used guns, Costello used power. And then there was Vito Genovese. Ambitious, ruthless, patient. He didn't just want power. He wanted control over everything. These men weren't just criminals. They were strategists, and together, they turned the Mafia into a machine. The Mafia didn't need to show force all the time. Their reputation did the job. Everyone knew what would happen if you crossed them. A businessman refuses to pay. His store burns down. A witness talks to the police. Evanisis. A rival tries to rise. He gets eliminated. This wasn't random violence. It was calculated fear, and it worked. One of the Mafia's smartest moves was taking over labor unions. At the time, unions controlled entire industries. Construction, transportation, the ports. By controlling unions, the Mafia controlled workers. And by controlling workers, they controlled businesses. If a company didn't cooperate, workers would strike, projects would stop, and money would freeze. Suddenly, the company had no choice. Pay the Mafia, or lose everything. Power doesn't survive without protection. And the Mafia knew that, so they bought it. Politicians were bribed, police were paid off, judges were influenced, cases disappeared. Investigations stopped, evidence vanished. The system that was supposed to stop crime was now protecting it, and that made the Mafia nearly untouchable. By the 1940s, the Mafia had reached a level of power never seen before. They weren't hiding anymore. They were operating in plain sight. Luxury suits, expensive cars, high-end restaurants. From the outside, they looked like successful businessmen. But behind the scenes, they controlled a criminal empire worth millions, and no one could stop them. The Mafia didn't stay limited to New York. They expanded to Chicago, Las Vegas, Miami. In cities like Chicago, figures like Al Capone had already proven how powerful organized crime could become. Now, with Luciano's system, that power spread nationwide. Las Vegas became their new playground, a place for casinos, gambling, and huge profits. The Mafia invested heavily and turned the desert into a money-making empire. One of their smartest strategies was blending in. They opened legitimate businesses, restaurants, nightclubs, construction companies. To the public, they were just entrepreneurs, but behind every business, there was something darker. Money laundering, illegal deals, hidden profits. They weren't just criminals anymore, they were invisible. The Code of Omerta still ruled everything. No one talked, no one cooperated. Even if someone was arrested, they stayed silent, because they knew the truth. Talking didn't just mean prison. It meant death, and not just for them, but for their families, too. That fear kept the system strong. For years, law enforcement underestimated the Mafia. They saw it as small gangs, local crime, nothing serious. But slowly, that changed. The federal government began to notice a pattern. Organized crime wasn't random. It was coordinated, and that realization would eventually lead to a war between the Mafia and the United States government. But at this moment in time, the Mafia was winning. They had money, they had power, they had influence. But power like this never lasts forever, because soon, greed, betrayal, and ambition would begin to crack the empire from within. And when the fall started, it would be brutal. In the next part, we dive into the secret structure behind everything. The rules, the hierarchy, and the hidden system that kept the Mafia running like a perfect machine. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. The secret structure of POWR New York. Mid-20th century. From the outside, everything looked normal. People went to work. Businesses ran as usual. The city never slept. But beneath that surface, there was another system. Hidden, silent, deadly. A system that didn't follow American law. A system that followed its own rules. This was the true structure of the Mafia, and almost no one understood how deep it really went. At the top of this system sat a group that controlled everything. The Commission, they weren't just leaders. They were the final authority. No major decision happened without their approval. No war started without their consent. No boss ruled without their recognition. They were the government behind the shadows. The hierarchy of POWR, the Mafia, wasn't chaos. It was a strict chain of command. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a place. At the very top of each family was the boss. The boss was absolute power. His word was law. His decisions were final. He controlled everything. Money, operations, violence. One of the most feared bosses in later years would be John Gatiba. Long before him, the structure was already in place. Right below the boss was the underboss. The second in command, the one who ran things when the boss wasn't around. Loyal, trusted, but always one step away from power. And sometimes, that closeness led to betrayal. TCO, NSA, IHE, LA, IE, the Shadow ADV. The Shadow ADV is orden que me role. Unlike any other, te consigliere. Not a soldier. Not a killer, but one of the most important figures in the entire organization. The consigliere was the advisor, the strategist, the voice of reason. When conflicts happened, he helped solve them. When decisions were risky, he gave guidance. One of the most famous consigliere-type figures was Frank Costello. He understood power better than most. Not through violence, but through influence. CAPOS. The Crulatas, Bello, the top leadership, were the capos. Short for cap. Each capo controlled a crew. A group of soldiers. They were responsible for making money, running operations, handling problems. They were the backbone of the Mafia. Each capo had to report to the boss. And every dollar flowed from soldiers to capos, from capos to the boss. A percentage of everything went to the top. And that made the boss incredibly rich. Soldiers, the ENFORCRs, at the bottom of the MAID members, were the soldiers. These were the men who did the work, collecting money, running rackets, carrying out orders, and when needed, killing. They were loyal, disciplined, and dangerous. Because once you became a soldier, there was no way out. Associates. BODSIDRs not. Everyone in the Mafia was officially part of it. There were also associates. These were people who worked with the Mafia, but weren't fully initiated. They could be anyone. Businessmen, lawyers, politicians, even regular workers. They helped the Mafia operate, and in return, they made money. But they had one problem. They weren't protected the same way. And if something went wrong, they were disposable. The initiation, becoming a full member wasn't easy. You had to earn it. Loyalty, respect, fearlessness, and often you had to prove yourself through violence. The initiation ceremony was secret, strict, symbolic. A finger would be pricked. Blood would drop onto a sacred image. Then the oath was taken, a promise of loyalty, a promise of silence, a promise that could never be broken. From that moment on, you were part of the family. And the family came before everything. The rules that controlled EVR Waitakai and Jitha Mafia had rules. Unwritten. but absolute. Never betray the family. Never talk to law enforcement. Never disrespect another made man. And most importantly, always follow orders. Breaking these rules had consequences. And those consequences were never small. How money moved the Mafia wasn't just about power. It was about profit. Money flowed through every level. Gambling, loan sharking, extortion, smuggling. Each operation generated cash, and that cash moved upward. From soldiers to capos. From capos to the boss, a percentage of everything went to the top. And that made the boss incredibly rich. Discipline through fear. The system worked because of discipline. And discipline was enforced through fear. If someone disobeyed, they were punished. If someone stole, they were punished. If someone talked, they disappeared. No exceptions, no second chances. Because the moment fear disappeared, the system would collapse. Internal giustizia. The Mafia didn't rely on courts. They had their own system of justice. Disputes were settled internally, through meetings, through discussions, through decisions made by leadership. Sometimes peacefully, sometimes violently, but always final. The power of unity. What made the Mafia so powerful was unity. Different families, different leaders, but one system, one structure. Through the commission, conflicts were controlled, wars were avoided, and business continued. This unity allowed them to dominate. For years, for decades, the cracks begin to form, but no system is perfect. Power creates ambition. Money creates greed. And inside this perfectly built structure, those cracks were already forming. Rivalries, jealousy, secrets, men who wanted more. Men who wanted control, and eventually, those desires would turn into betrayal. End of part 3. The Mafia had built a perfect machine, a system of power, money, and fear. But the bigger the empire, the harder the fall. Because soon, the rules would be broken, the code would be shattered, and the silence that protected them would begin to disappear. In the next part, we enter the bloodiest era of the Mafia, where alliances collapse and the streets run red again. Blood, betrayal, and WR New York, late 1940s into the 1950s. From the outside, the Mafia looked untouchable. The system was working. Money was flowing. Power was secure. But inside, something was changing. Because power does one thing to men, it makes them want more. And in a world where ambition has no limits, there is only one outcome. Conflict. The beginning of internal TNA-Sion. The structure built by Charles Luciano was strong, but it had one weakness. It depended on loyalty, and loyalty doesn't always last. As years passed, new leaders began to rise, more aggressive, more ambitious, less patient. They didn't want to share power. They wanted control. The rise of a dangerous Meandi, one of the most dangerous among them, was Vito Genovese. Had been waiting, watching, planning. 4 years, he stayed in the background, but now, he was ready to move. Genovese didn't just want influence, he wanted the throne and to head it. He would do whatever it took. The fall of Old Alliance, he sat. One time, the Mafia leaders worked together, but now, trust was fading. Suspicion grew. Meetings became tense. Alliances became fragile. Because everyone knew the truth in T's world. Friends could become enemies overnight. Power struggles began behind closed doors. Plans were being made, not for business, but for elimination. Leaders began targeting each other, quietly, carefully, because open war was bad for business. But silent war, that was different. It was cleaner, harder to trace, more dangerous. The DSAP, no witnesses, no bodies, no answers. One day they were there, the next, gone, and everyone understood what it meant. Someone had made a move. The role of the CIOM, MS, CION during this chaos. The commission tried to maintain order. Meetings were held. Conflicts were discussed. Warnings were given. But even the commission had limits, because when ambition becomes stronger than rules, rules stop mattering. Fear spreads through the Aranca. Soldiers became nervous. Capos became cautious, because no one knew who would be next. Trust disappeared. Paranoia took its place. Every conversation felt dangerous. Every meeting felt like a trap. And in the Mafia, paranoia is deadly. The cost of POWR to become boss. You needed more than intelligence. You needed ruthlessness. Because rising to the top meant one thing: removing whoever stood in your way. And that often meant killing your own brothers, friends, allies. In the Mafia, nothing was personal. Only power mattered. The Nuji and Orati, Owen Azol, their leaders weakened. A new generation began to rise. More violent, more bold, less respectful of tradition. They didn't care about the old rules. They cared about results. Money, control, dominance, and they were willing to risk everything to get it. Expansion of Violenci the Vila that Luciano once tried to control was returning. Not in open war, but in calculated strikes, targeted killings, strategic hits, silent executions, each one sending a message. No one is safe. The shadow of BTRO. Most dangerous thing in the Mafia is not the enemy. It's betrayal, because enemies are expected. But betrayal comes from within. And when it happens, it destroys everything. The balance begins to break for years. The Mafia maintained balance. But now, that balance was breaking. Too many ambitions, too many secrets, too many grudges. And slowly, the system began to crack. The government still WHCS while all of this was happening. Law enforcement was learning. The government had started to understand something important. This wasn't just crime. This was an organization. And organizations can be taken down, but not from the outside. From the inside, the first signs of WRCNES, the Mafia still looked powerful, still looked untouchable. But inside, it was changing. The unity was fading. The silence was weakening. And once those two things break, the entire system begins to fall. End of Part 4. RICO Empire was still standing. Still powerful. Still feared. But beneath the surface, it was starting to collapse. Because soon, someone would break the code. Someone would talk. And when that happened, everything would change. In the next part, we enter the golden era of wealth and excess, where the Mafia reaches its peak and becomes richer, more powerful, and more dangerous than ever before. The golden era of crime, America, 1950s to 1960s. This was the peak. The moment where the Mafia wasn't just powerful, it was unstoppable. The streets were quiet, the wars had cooled, and behind that calm, money was flowing like never before. This wasn't survival anymore. This was domination. The empire of Emuniy by now. The 5 families had perfected their system. Everything was organized. Everything was controlled. Every illegal business, every underground deal, every hidden operation led back to them. They weren't just making money. They were printing it. Millions turned into tens of millions. Tens of millions turned into something bigger. And the most dangerous part, no one could see it. Las Vegas, the new Geo. Lanithian Kim, the desert. A place that would change everything. Las Vegas, at first, It was nothing. Just sand, heat, and opportunity. But the Mafia saw something others didn't. A chance to turn gambling into an empire. Casinos started rising. Lights filled the night. Tourists came from everywhere. And behind many of those casinos, there was hidden control. Money poured in every single day. But not all of it was reported. The Mafia had a system. Simple, effective, invisible. It was called the skim. Before profits were officially recorded, a portion of the money was quietly taken. No taxes, no records, no trace. Millions of dollars vanished straight into Mafia pockets, and no one could prove it. The men who controlled Vegas behind the scenes, powerful figures, made sure everything ran smoothly. One of the most influential was Meyer Lansky. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he was a genius with money. He understood systems, numbers, flow of cash, and he helped turn Las Vegas into a financial machine for the Mafia. The luxury life with money came a new lifestyle. Expensive suits, luxury cars, private clubs. Mafia bosses didn't hide anymore. They showed their success. High-end restaurants, famous nightclubs, connections with celebrities. They weren't just criminals. They were icons, respected, feared, admired. Hollywood and the MIFI, the influence, didn't stop at business. It reached entertainment. There were whispers of connections with Hollywood, actors, producers, studios, deals made behind closed doors, opportunities controlled quietly. The Mafia wasn't just in the streets. It was in culture, control over INDs by this time. The Mafia had expanded far beyond gambling. They controlled construction projects, shipping ports, garbage disposal, even entire labor unions. If a major project happened in New York, they were involved. Nothing moved without their approval. Political PROTCTIO, and their biggest weapon wasn't guns. It was influence. Politicians were still being controlled, bribed, pressured. Laws bent in their favor. Investigations slowed down. Cases disappeared. The system was still protecting them, and that made them even stronger. The image of POWER to the public. They looked untouchable. They walked freely, spoke confidently, lived openly, because they believed something, that they had become too powerful to fall. And for a while, they were right. The cost of SUCC's SBUT success has a price. The more powerful they became, the more visible they became. And visibility is dangerous, because now people were starting to notice. Journalists, investigators, government officials. They began asking questions. How did these men become so rich? How did they gain so much control? And slowly, the truth started to surface. The government strikes BAC Katha. U.S. government could no longer ignore it. Organized crime wasn't a rumor anymore. It was real, and it was powerful. So they began to act. Investigations increased. Surveillance started. Evidence was collected. The Mafia was no longer invisible. They were being watched. The beginning of PRESUR. At first, the Mafia didn't worry. They had survived before. They had connections. They had protection. But this was different. The government wasn't looking at individuals anymore. They were targeting the entire system. And that made things dangerous. Cracks in the MP. Are inside the Mafia. The pressure was being felt. Arrests started happening. Questions started being asked, and for the first time in years, fear began to return. Not fear of rival gangs, but fear of something new. The law. The silence starts to Sisakitha. Code of silence. Omerta had protected them for decades, but pressure changes people. Prison changes people. And soon, someone would break. The Mafia had reached its peak. More money than ever. More power than ever. But at the top, there's only one direction left. Down. Because the government was closing in, and the silence that protected the empire was about to shatter. In the next part, we entered the beginning of the end, where the FBI launches its war against the Mafia, and the first cracks turn into collapse. The war with the FBI, late 1960s into the 1970s. For decades, the Mafia ruled from the shadows. They had power. They had money. They had control. But now, they had a new enemy. An enemy that wouldn't be bribed, wouldn't be intimidated, wouldn't stop. The federal government, and at the center of this war, was an agency that had finally started to understand the truth. Federal Bureau of Investigation, the REL. RIO in 4 years. The government underestimated the Mafia. They saw small gangs, local criminals. But now, they saw the full picture. A nationwide criminal network. Organized, structured, dangerous, and most importantly, growing. This wasn't just crime anymore. This was a threat to the entire system. A new STRAT, why the old methods didn't work. Arresting small members did nothing, because the system stayed intact. So the FBI changed its strategy. Instead of targeting individuals, they targeted the organization itself. They wanted to destroy the structure, the hierarchy, the system built by Charles Luciano, and to do that, they needed something powerful. Evidence, surveillance BGI, and as the FBI started watching. Closely, constantly. Phones were tapped, meetings were monitored, movements were tracked. For the first time, the Mafia was being studied. Patterns were discovered. Connections were mapped. The invisible empire was becoming visible. The Appalachian meets the Anji. Then came a moment that changed everything. In 1957, a secret Mafia meeting took place. Leaders from across the country gathered in one place. This event is known as the Appalachian Meeting. It was supposed to be private, hidden, but something went wrong. Law enforcement discovered the meeting, and suddenly, dozens of powerful Mafia figures were exposed. Running, escaping, caught on record. For the first time, the government had proof. The Mafia was real, and it was organized. Public. XPO Suarida. News spread quickly. Newspapers reported it. People talked about it. The myth of the Mafia being invisible was shattered. Now, the public knew. And once the public knows something, it becomes impossible to hide. Legal, apo honesta. Government needed stronger tools. So they created them. New laws, new strategies, new ways to fight organized crime. The most powerful among them was RICO Act. This law changed everything. Before this, it was hard to convict Mafia bosses, because they didn't commit crimes directly. They gave orders, stayed distant, stayed protected. But RICO made one thing clear. If you were part of a criminal organization, you could be charged for everything that organization did, even if you never pulled the trigger. The game Siete and Gistis was a nightmare for the Mafia, because now their entire structure was a liability. Being part of the system was enough to destroy them, and the FBI knew it. The first informants. Then came the biggest threat of all. Not guns, not laws, but people, men from inside the Mafia, started to break. At first, it was rare, because the code of silence, omerta, was still strong. But pressure changes everything. Long prison sentences, fear, isolation, and slowly, some men chose survival over loyalty. They started talking. The value of informatio and 2. The FBI. This was gold, because for the first time, they weren't guessing anymore. They were learning from the inside. How the system worked, who was involved, where the money went. Secrets that were protected for decades were now being revealed. Paranoia inside the MAF, inside the Mafia. Things were changing. Trust was disappearing. Meetings became more secret. Conversations became shorter because no one knew who could be next. Anyone could be an informant. Anyone could betray. And in a system built on loyalty, that fear is deadly. High-profile Tadshitsta, FBI didn't stop at small players. They aimed high. Bosses, underbosses, capos. The leaders themselves were now targets, and with RICO, they could finally be reached. The first major CRSX arrests began increasing. Cases became stronger. Convictions started happening. For the first time in decades, the Mafia was losing. Not in the streets, but in the courts. The end of IMV. IB, the Mafia believed they were untouchable. Now, that illusion was gone. They could be watched. They could be tracked. They could be convicted. And that changed everything. Internal collapse. Giannis's pressure increased. The structure began to weaken. Leaders became cautious. Operations slowed down, and the code of silence started to crack. Because when survival is at risk, even the strongest loyalty can break. End of Part 6. A Chokatha war had begun. And for the first time, the Mafia wasn't winning. The FBI had new weapons, new strategies. But the biggest weapon was yet to come, because soon, one man would step forward. A man from inside the Mafia. A man who would reveal everything. And when he talked, the Empire would never be the same again. In the next part, we enter the era of informants, betrayal at the highest level, and the beginning of the Mafia's collapse. Rats, betrayal, and the beginning of the end of 1970s. The war had already begun. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was watching, listening, building cases. And for the first time, the Mafia felt pressure they couldn't control, not from rivals, not from the streets, but from something far more dangerous. The truth. The man who broke the COD 4 decades. The Mafia survived because of one rule. Omerta silence. No one talked, no matter what. But in 1963, that changed. One man stepped forward. A man from inside the system. Joseph Velassi wasn't the most powerful. He wasn't a boss. But what he knew was enough to shake the entire empire. The Velassi Herings Valachi did something no one had ever done before. He spoke publicly, in front of the government. In front of the world, this moment became known as the Velassi hearings. For the first time, the inner workings of the Mafia were exposed. The structure, the rules, the rituals, even the name. Cosa Nostra, what was once secret, was now public knowledge. THEIMP, Citiitha. Effect was immediate. The Mafia's biggest weapon, silence, was broken. And once silence is broken, fear follows. Because now, everyone knew. The government, the public, even low-level members. The myth of invincibility was gone. The rise of INFO-MANTs after Velassi. Others started thinking, is loyalty worth dying for? Is silence worth life in prison? Slowly, the unthinkable began to happen. More members started cooperating. They became what the Mafia feared most. Rats. Why they tell Kadeen. Not all of them talked for the same reason. Some were scared. Some were angry. Some wanted revenge. Others simply wanted to survive. Because the reality was changing. The Mafia could no longer protect everyone. And when protection disappears, so does loyalty. Inside Secrets, EXPOSED. With every informant, more secrets came out. Names, operations, locations. The FBI no longer had to guess. They knew. They knew who ran what, who reported to whom, where the money flowed. Decades of hidden operations were now visible. Paranoia takes over inside the mafia. Everything changed. Trust disappeared completely. Friends became suspects. Allies became threats. Every conversation felt dangerous. Every meeting felt risky. Because anyone could be next. Anyone could talk. Internal violence, INCRASSD, stop the damage. The mafia reacted the only way they knew. Violence. Suspected informants were eliminated. No questions, no trials. Just disappearance. But this created another problem. More fear, more instability. And sometimes they killed the wrong person. The system BRK's the structure that once made the mafia strong was now becoming a weakness. Because the more organized it was, the easier it became to expose. One informant could reveal an entire network. One mistake could destroy everything, and those mistakes were starting to happen more often. The government gains POWR with every new piece of information. The Federal Bureau of Investigation grew stronger. Cases became solid. Evidence became clear. Arrests turned into convictions, and convictions turned into long prison sentences. The mafia wasn't just being attacked anymore. It was being dismantled. The fall of FAR for years, people were afraid to speak. But now, that fear was fading. Witnesses started cooperating. Victims started reporting, because they saw something new. The mafia could be beaten. The beginning of the A&D. By the late 1970s, the damage was clear. The mafia was still powerful, still dangerous, but no longer untouchable. The cracks had turned into fractures, and those fractures were spreading. The next level of BTR, well, but the worst was yet to come, because if Valassi shook the system, the next wave would destroy it. High-ranking members, trusted insiders, powerful figures, men who knew everything. And when they talked, there would be no secrets left. The silence was broken. The trust was gone, and the empire was starting to fall apart. But the most shocking betrayals had not happened yet, because soon even the most loyal men would turn. And when they did, the mafia would face its greatest collapse in history. In the next part, we enter the era of high-level informants, powerful bosses being exposed, and the system breaking from the top down. America, 1980s. The empire was still standing, still powerful, still dangerous. But now, it was bleeding from the inside. The era of silence was over, and what replaced it was betrayal at the highest level. For years, the government chased soldiers, La Leva members. But now, they had a new goal. Take down the leadership, the bosses, the men who controlled everything, with the help of informants and the power of the RICO Act. This was finally possible. Then came one of the biggest moments in mafia history, a case that would change everything. The Commission case. Using years of surveillance, wiretaps, and insider testimony, the government went after the top leadership of the 5 families. This wasn't a small operation. This was a direct attack on the entire system. And for the first time, it worked. The courtroom replaced the streets. No guns, no ambushes, just evidence. Testimony, truth. Bosses, who once ruled in silence, now sat under bright lights, facing charges, facing exposure, facing something they never feared before. Justice. For decades, the mafia survived because of influence. Police connections, political ties, corruption. But now, that protection was failing because the cases were too strong. The evidence too clear and the pressure too high. One by one, leaders were convicted, sentenced to long prison terms. Some for decades, some for life. Men who once controlled millions, now sat in prison cells. Their empires gone, their power gone, even in this chaos. Some tried to hold on. One of the most famous was John Gotti. He was bold, confident, public. Unlike the old bosses, he didn't hide. He became known as the Teflon Don because, case after case, he walked free. But that illusion wouldn't last. Gotti's biggest strength became his biggest weakness. His own inner circle. The man he trusted the most turned against him. Sammy Gravano, a high-ranking member, a loyal insider, until he made a decision to cooperate. He revealed everything. Murders, operations, orders, even direct involvement of Gotti himself. The level of detail was devastating. This was someone from the top. With Gravano's testimony, the case against Gotti became unstoppable. In 1992, the verdict came. Guilty. John Gotti was sentenced to life in prison. The man who once ruled the streets of New York was finished. Gotti's fall wasn't just one man losing power. It was a symbol. If someone like him could fall, Anjone, cool, and that realization spread fear across the entire mafia. The damage was now irreversible. Trust was destroyed. Without leadership, the structure collapsed. The same system that once made them powerful now made them vulnerable. By the 1990s, the mafia was no longer what it used to be. Still present, still dangerous, but weaker, more courageous. The bosses had fallen. The system was broken, but the story wasn't over. The mafia evolved, changed, adapted, and its legacy still exists today. America, 2000s and beyond. The streets are quieter now. The flashy casinos aren't ruled openly by crime families. The golden era of the mafia is gone. But the empire's legacy remains, the remnants of power. Even after decades of convictions, betrayals, and government pressure, 5 families still exist. Their influence is smaller. Their operations are subtler. Their methods are smarter. Instead of flashy violence, they focus on businesses, investments, and influence behind the scenes. Control isn't public anymore. It's hidden, silent, strategic. The modern mafia. The mafia today is nothing like it once was. Gone are the open hits and public dominance. Gone are the days of luxury cars and brash power displays. Now, it's all about survival. Money laundering, lone shark in construction and labor influence. Cyber schemes, technology, surveillance, and law enforcement have forced them underground. The culture they left behind. The mafia has left a mark that can't be erased. Movies, books, documentaries. The world is fascinated by them. The Godfather, Goodfellas, and countless others immortalize their rise and fall. The rules, rituals, and codes of the past still inspire stories, even if the streets no longer obey them. The lesson of power. The history of the Mafia isn't just about crime. It's about ambition, structure, fear, loyalty, betrayal, and ultimately, the fragility of power. No empire lasts forever, even one built on fear, money, and silence. Today's reflection. Today, organized crime is smaller, more secretive, and more strategic. Law enforcement has the upper hand. Technology exposes secrets faster. Informants and legal tools keep the system in check. But the legacy lives on. The Mafia shaped New York. It influenced American business, culture, and politics. It left a story that still fascinates the world. From chaos to power. From fear to betrayal. From golden empires to cautious shadows. The American Mafia has seen it all. It rose from the ashes of Prohibition, built empires of wealth and influence, and fell when loyalty broke. Silence shattered, and justice prevailed. The streets remember. The legends remain. The empire may never rise the same way again, but history will always remember the most powerful mafia empire in American history.